Hi students, it's Mrs. T and this is week 2 in Gender Studies class. You have to already have seen the week 1 videos for this one to flow into the conversation. So make sure that you go back and watch those, especially if you didn't add this class to your schedule this semester until this week. So all of the videos are required. Don't just start with this one, okay? This one in general, though, is not going to specifically talk about gender and gender topics like the third video. I put 2 fingers up, but I said 3. The third video in the week 1 folder started to talk about the difference between sex and gender and some of the terminology differences that we should use as educated individuals when we are discussing sex as opposed to discussing gender. The terminology is different. Male, female, intersex, those are sex terms. Masculine, feminine, neutral, and everything in between, these are gender terms, okay? But today, for our very first lesson this week, and this lesson doesn't just apply to this week, it applies to everything that we do between now and the end of the semester, not only in our class, but any other time you are in any other class that challenges the way that you thought reality was organized. I need you to remember this class, this day with Mrs. T, because we're going to talk about 2 common concepts, ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, but we're going to talk about how important they are to understand those concepts in order to develop tolerance, to understand cultural awareness, and have that kind of ability to foster understanding and community across belief systems, across cultural ways and rituals. And these 2 concepts are going to really help us catch ourselves if we start to be judgmental. Now I know most of you are saying to yourself, oh, I'm not judgmental, I have a very open mind and everybody's fine with me. However, in this class this semester, I am going to try to challenge that notion with you, and I'm going to try to bring you to the realization that all of us have ethnocentrism and that cultural relativism is not easy to practice under all circumstances, nor should we necessarily practice it under all circumstances. Okay? So let me dive in and talk about ethnocentrism first, okay? So ethnocentrism, I have the word notion here. It's the notion that you're superior, your culture's ways, your rituals, your beliefs, fill in the blank here. I've got several different words listed on the board. Your customs, your cultural traits, your beliefs, your rituals are superior to other people's beliefs, rituals, etc. This is more than just a notion. It's really a tendency that all of us have. It is not a born-in tendency that we have as human beings. Rather, when we are born, we immediately begin learning our culture. Even though we don't have a conscious memory of learning our culture, we begin learning at that moment that we are born. And therefore, by the time we do develop a memory, think about that for a second. How old were you in your first memory? How old do you know for sure you were? I think I was 5 for the memory, the active memory that I have. And there was a whole lot of learning, 5 years worth of learning that went on before I have an active memory of myself as a child. And because I learned all of this stuff, sometimes we say that we have things that come, look at my air quotes, naturally to us. It feels natural, or it feels right or correct because we've, quote, always done it that way, close quote. Well, those kinds of tendencies or those kinds of notions that something comes naturally, that's founded in a concept called ethnocentrism. It's a tendency that all of us learn, passively learn through life, that our way of doing things is correct or superior to other people's ways of doing things if they are different from our own. Gender and gender roles, which we will talk about specifically in our next video, the differences in gender categories and gender roles that we're going to learn about not only in our own culture, but especially in cultures around the world, when we look at the differences that exist in other cultures that are going to blow your mind in some cases because they're so far out of sight from what our social idea of reality is. We have to catch ourselves and guard against this tendency. Ethnocentrism can have very negative effects if we judge too harshly others and we say things like, you're wrong for your cultural group is wrong for doing a certain thing a certain way. You are incorrect. You are inferior to my cultural pattern because you are not doing things in the way that I learned to do them. That's an ethnocentric standpoint. That's an ethnocentric approach to analyzing other cultures. And we all have a tendency to do that. And you're not a bad person if you have a tendency to do that. We all, Mrs. T, has a tendency to do that right alongside you all, okay? We have to catch ourselves and train ourselves, let me use a psychology word, condition ourselves to catch and stop our tendency to be ethnocentric, okay? However, ethnocentrism does have a positive side. It has a negative side when we have the power. If we have this idea that you're inferior and I'm superior, and I've got the power and the muscle and the money to force you to give up your way of life and adopt my way of life just because I say so, honey. That's the negative side of ethnocentrism. But there is a positive side of ethnocentrism also. Please don't ask me where the line is between the positive side and the negative side, because I'm afraid I have to confess to you, I'm going to give you a good semester of learning this semester, but I'm just not smart enough to tell you definitively where the line is between the positive side of ethnocentrism and the negative side of ethnocentrism. But there is a positive side. For instance, if you feel loyalty to your group, such as, let's think of a silly example like a high school football team or a pro football team. If you are part of the fandom of the Dallas Cowboys or something, and you follow that team and you're loyal to that team, or for me, the Patriots, if you follow that team and you're loyal to that team, that loyalty, that faithful following comes from ethnocentric tendencies. And I used another word there, faith. If you are part of a faith system, I am part of a faith system. I regard what the customs, the habits, the rituals, the beliefs, I think about those cultures, the customs, habits, beliefs, pardon me, I'm getting tongue-tied. I think of those things as correct, as right, as pleasing to my Creator. If you do not have a similar faith tendency as I do, I maybe feel a little sorry for you, or feel like, gee, I wonder could I convert you to my way of thinking because my faith system is correct. That kind of tendency is, of course, ethnocentrism. And typically, we would not judge someone harshly for having a strong belief in their faith system. Whatever faith system you ascribe, then your belief and your loyalty to that faith system comes from ethnocentrism. If you feel patriotism to your country, ethnocentrism. If you feel obligation for military service or for public service, ethnocentrism comes from that. Or those feelings come from it, okay? So there is a positive side of ethnocentrism, but there's a very negative side too when you're completely closed off to any possibility that other ways of life are just as good, if not better, than yours in many ways, for some kind of blind reason that you don't recognize anything but your own way of life. Okay, sorry, but don't ask me where the line is between the positive side of ethnocentrism and the negative side. We've got to be able to analyze our own thought process well enough to catch ourselves when we are being unnecessarily intolerant of other ways of life. Okay? When I say unnecessarily intolerant against other ways of life, please remember my careful choice of words there, because we are going to look at some videos that I did not make, but that some anthropologists made about gender categories elsewhere that involve body modification to the point where you and I in our culture might say, this is mutilation, this is child abuse, this is horrific, and we have got to stop it. Your culture is not correct to do this. Our culture doesn't do it. We have a different idea of respect of human rights than your culture does, and we're going to force you to give up your customs, your habits, your rituals, because we don't like what you're doing. We categorize something as mutilation, you categorize it as a necessary part of your gender life. So cliffhanger there, but we will watch that video. I'll explain it a little bit more in another video, but we will watch that I specifically am choosing because it's related to gender, and it's going to definitely drive at your ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism is okay if we don't take it too far. All right? So, not really entirely on the flip side, but a counter argument to ethnocentrism is something we call cultural relativism. This is really like a research technique. It's really a point of view that you can employ as a social scientist when you're doing cultural comparisons and cultural research. Cultural relativism is the idea that a culture has a right to its own way of life, its own history, its own rituals, its own belief. And even when those things are different from yours, you can't use your faith system, your ritual system, your culture's way of life to judge other cultures. Instead, you must use that culture and that culture only, their history, their belief systems, their point of view, to understand why and perhaps how certain cultural traits came to be part of that particular system of rituals, customs, habits, beliefs. So cultural relativism is not exactly a cure for ethnocentrism, and it's also not exactly the opposite of ethnocentrism. Instead, it's sort of a lens that you need to practice putting on that makes you more objective when you are looking at a culture, when you are studying a culture. For instance, I'll use a specific example here. When I teach anthropology class, one of the things that my students are completely fascinated by is the concept of polyandry. Polyandry is a gender word, really, because it's referring to a particular marriage pattern where a female, or a wife, there's a gender category, wife, has multiple husbands simultaneously. In our culture, we don't do that, right? We're supposed to have fidelity and monogamy in marriage, but other cultures don't have that belief, don't have that custom, and therefore multiple sexual relationships simultaneously are perfectly acceptable. And I use an example in Tibet where fraternal polyandry, or a female married to multiple brothers simultaneously, is or has been in the past very common. And it's an answer to poverty. You can use cultural relativism to understand that this cultural pattern of polyandry was an answer to poverty. Because if brothers are going to inherit a tiny bit of nothing from their parents, they don't want to split it up 4 ways if there's 4 brothers and they end up with a smaller tiny bit of nothing. They want to pool whatever resources they are able to carry from one generation to the next, pool it into one particular homestead and business, so to speak. And if they share one wife, it's an excellent birth control practice, honestly, because a woman can only have so many babies in her lifetime, whereas a man can have as many babies simultaneously with as many women as he can get his hands on, so to speak, and that's extremely expensive. So fraternal polyandry is something that quite often my students, and maybe you right now, are having ethnocentric firing going off in your brain synapses right now. It's like, whoa, I can't wrap my brain around this. I've got to research this. That's my reaction paper topic, or whatever is going on in your head right now. But if we are culturally relativistic, we're able to zoom out, we're able to forget our culture's notions about right and wrong, because usually we use those judgmental words when we're talking about issues of sexual fidelity in marriage or monogamy versus polygamy. But if we use a cultural relativistic point of view and we zoom out and we look at all the social conditions that factor into this society that I'm describing to you, poverty, systemic poverty, generational poverty is part of the cultural schema for generations. And this particular cultural practice is an excellent way for this particular culture to keep the population under control, keep wealth within the hands of blood relatives, and manage a situation of food insecurity that can't really ensure that many babies will achieve adulthood anyway. So there's so many different kinds of objective reasons why that kind of marital practice is appropriate, correct, and wonderful for their particular society. But there's just as many cultural reasons why that particular marriage practice is not acceptable in our culture's background. Okay? So we are going to look at many, and especially at the very beginning of the semester, we're going to look at multiple cultures worldwide. We're going to look at something called rites of passage. That is R-I-T-E, a rite, the root word of the word ritual. We're going to look at many different rites of passage that are associated with a transition from one gender category to another gender category in life. These things exist in multiple forms in other parts of the world, and we're going to look at that first as a way to explore this concept of gender binary that I briefly mentioned in the third video during week 1. So the next video that you and I talk about is going to be about that gender binary, but I just realized I forgot to tell you one thing about cultural relativism. I haven't told you many things about cultural relativism, but one particular thing that you need to know is that it is similar to ethnocentrism in at least one way. There is a good side and there is a bad side to cultural relativism. If you take this too far, let's say there is a culture that every third female, when they hit 10, the group kills them and eats them. I'm making this up, okay? I don't know of a culture that does that. But do we need to practice cultural relativism so intently that we look at that culture and we say, oh, okay, we don't do that in my society, but you go right on ahead? I don't think so. I don't think that we can say that cultural relativism is so important and must be practiced so intently that we look at this, what we describe as murder, and they just describe as ritual cannibalism. Like, where's the line there? So just like ethnocentrism has a line between it's okay and it's really bad, cultural relativism has a line someplace between it's a really good thing or it can really be taken too far. Okay? Does Mrs. T know where that line is? I'm sorry, sweetheart, I don't. But maybe you can debate about where that line is with some specific examples that we watch later on this week about gender behaviors that exist worldwide, what the gender binary is. We're going to start with this gender binary thing because that's just a common word that we hear in USA culture these days. But there are so many additional nuances to the gender binary worldwide that that anyway, I hope we will open your eyes to how really restricted the viewpoint is in the United States about a gender binary. So at least that's Mrs. T's 2 cents for this first video lecture during week 2. Text me with questions, and if you have any ideas that came from this video to write about for your reaction paper, please feel free to do that, or a combination of this with the other lectures that are required this week. There's 4, maybe 5 videos that are required this week, so please feel free to take your reaction paper topic from any or all of them, and quiz questions will come from all of them. So text me with questions. I look forward to hearing from you, and I will see you soon. Bye.